A war that seemed to be forgotten, or at least in the film world, has within the last decade emerged to its cinematic potential. World War I, one of the more innovative and brutal wars for its time, really changed the format of tactics within warfare. It's also been a topic and task that filmmakers more recently have brought back to life. Tonight, we hit the trenches, strap up our boots, and head to no man's land as we do a discussion of sorts on why has the movement of World War I movies taken storm. This is a Comic Talkers production, and you are listening to Just for Flicks. What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Patty B. With me today, as always, is Mr. B Dog. It's Mr. Brandon. What are we doing today, Mr. B Dog?
Well, you know what? I'm excited because we're going to be talking about World War One, but we couldn't do this without a guest. I'm bringing back to the podcast my Comic Talker co-host, my confidant in this. Please welcome back to the podcast, Miss Mary. Mary, how are you doing?
Good. It's good to be here. I actually am very excited. I actually wrote my lesson plan assignment for my master's class on World War One over the summer. So I'm really excited.
Now, fans, like Pat said and like Mary said, we're going to be going over World War One and why World War One has become more prominent within the last 10 to 15 years in movies, and compare them to even the old movies that have come out in World War One, and kind of see the differences between nowadays to back then. Mary, let's talk with you because I know I am majoring in history. You do have a degree in history. Talk to us a little bit about World War One films in your eyes. If they've been depicted well in your eyes, have they not? Or talk with
So I think one of the really great things, and this is a terrible this is a terrible way to word this. One of my favorite things about the aftermath of World War One or the Great War, is that it immediately has an effect on art. Film isn't really a whole thing yet, but there's an entire new genre of World War One inspired poetry and literature that's coming out after 1918. My favorite poem of all time is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, which is a direct response to the horrors of the Great War. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating about World War One media and art compared to art focusing around other wars is that much like the Korean War, it is inherently viewed as a negative thing that never should have happened. It's we never should have been there. Um, these men should not have died.
Mhm.
We are not getting any pro-war narratives from really anybody
Mhm.
about this conflict. And I think a lot of what's been coming out in the last 10-ish years, which is, of course, due to the 100th anniversary of the conflict itself, um, is coming out and it's sort of re-emerging with this idea of anti-war sentiment and the ways in which an unprecedented conflict and a global conflict of this scale and the political mechanizations of elites who are not in touch with the men who are going to be fighting for them. It is very much the epitome of the rich man's war.
Mhm.
And I feel like due to not just the anniversary of the conflict, but also the just reality of the world that we're living in and the political climate that we're in,
Mhm.
with sort of the incredibly tense sense of mutually assured destruction that we have, which is more of a feeling we tend to associate with post World War II. Um, but we don't really know what warfare would look like with modern technology, right? We don't have a global conflict on that scale in mind. And so I think it's a kind of scary thing to think about. And I think that's kind of part of why World War One narratives have flourished, is because, like, again, like it's come back because it's the 100th anniversary. And I think there's been a whole lot more research done into it.
And and that's a good point to bring up. And that's why I said we're on the eve, or was it we already are past its 100th anniversary because the war started in
Yep.
1914. Um, but what's so interesting about these films, and I know I've talked with Pat about this, is that they're not always American made. They're most
No.
British.
And I think it's important to remember too that like as Americans, we were barely in this war.
We
Yeah.
were in it for just about close to 1 year, and that was about it. We were joined in
We
1970.
we we entered in 1917. The thing was over in 18. We weren't we didn't do a whole lot there.
No.
This is
What part of
fundamentally
what part of 1917 did we enter the war? Because I know what the war ended in November of 18, right?
um
Because
Not to
it
put
was,
everyone on the spot, I was just thinking
I
about
know,
it.
yeah. Yeah,
I'm trying to
that's a good
remember.
question. I can't remember. Right.
April 17.
Okay.
April of 17.
And the sad thing was we weren't even asking. We were helping, but we weren't asking to go into the war.
No, we were doing all sorts of weird, sketchy backroom deals.
Yeah. Wasn't
Um,
yeah, because it I think we joined because Germany was trying to convince Mexico to take us over or start a war with
yeah,
and then
Germany was doing a lot of weird things trying to call on like the old colonization of Texas and Mexico that they had had, and it just wasn't working.
What?
There's a lot. There's
They
a
were trying
lot
to
going on.
lure them in with Texas. That's what.
So Germany used to own part of Texas.
Mhm.
There's an entire section of Texas that still has a huge population of native German speakers. In northern Mexico and some parts of southern Germany, southern Texas. Oh my God, um, have that's why polka is so big in northern Mexico and southern Texas, is because of the influence of German colonists. So it's like a really weird timeline. I was actually weirdly just talking about this with people a few days ago. But yeah, no, New Germany is a weird thing.
Yeah.
And it's really, really cool.
It's
Um,
it's one of those
it's a very 1840s phenomenon.
and that's the thing. It's like most of these films, when you really look at it, like even one I know Pat will bring up, probably talking about the movies more recently, is All Quiet on the Western Front. And it is a German-made film. It is a very powerful film to be a foreign. It just the visuals alone gets you. But mind you, this isn't the first time they've made this movie. This is
Yeah,
now the second, I believe, either the second or the third time they've made this
I
movie.
think it's like the third because I think there was one in 1930 and one in like 76 or something like that in the mid
Yeah.
70s, I believe.
And yeah, because 1930 is the one I'm familiar with, because that was shortly after the
Yeah.
book was written too, and they made it into a movie. And
Hmm.
they had I don't remember the remake, and then this one. And just to see, I think it's like a sense of and seeing that's where we'll get into talking about why there's a lot of World War II films, World War One, which I think that's kind of an easy question because World War II was kind of like the height of movies. It was the height of movies being made during that time, during that war.
Yeah.
So, but World War One, it's a sense of it tends. It's like Pat says, it's like a time that gets tend to be forgotten about at some point.
And
Hmm.
I'm thinking too, and for the life of me, I cannot find this video. But I had a professor in college who talked about the Douaumont ossuary in France.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know if you are familiar. So the Douaumont ossuary is basically a giant building that houses just the bones of thousands upon thousands of men who died at Douaumont. Um, and there is this film made in the 1920s, and it's a silent film about essentially the horrors of the Great War, and the ossuary spins.
Oh wow.
Um, and I can't find it, and it's triggering me because I don't remember what it's called because I don't speak French, and it's driving me nuts. And this professor has retired, and I don't have his personal email.
So if you're
I've
listening,
been looking for this literally like all week in preparation to like try to send it to you.
to this, do you remember what was the professor's name? I have to ask now.
Richard Striner. He's a very eccentric man. He wears only like 1920s and 30s linen suits. He's one of my favorite human beings of all
Sorry,
time.
I
I
didn't mean to
love
laugh
him
so hard.
dearly.
That's
Professor
awesome.
Steiner, if you're listening to this, please send us that. We want to watch that.
Save me, Rick. Wonderful human being. One of my all-time favorite professors. But I just, oh my God. But I mean, and that's kind of the thing too, is like even those movies, like America was like the Like we were the movie people. We kind of still are. But especially in the early 20th century, I mean, hello. There is not to say that there weren't European films being made because of course there were, but it wasn't at the same frequency.
Hmm.
And the the film scene wasn't as I want to say notorious because 20s and 30s Hollywood is a nightmare.
Well, see, there's
Yeah.
another thing I want to bring up too, Mary, because you brought up a good point with literature and poetry and art overall. This is an inspiration too, and there is a movie they made about now. Is it historically accurate? Not always, but this kind of is one of the things that people say kind of helped Tolkien create the
Oh
Lord.
my God. There are so many. Tolkien can say as much as he wants that his experiences in the Great War did not influence his writing.
Oh yeah, it,
But if you read any of his writing and you know literally anything about A, his life,
yep.
or B, the Great War, you're gonna call bullshit.
Yeah, it's a sense of it's like the darker theme of the battles and everything like that. You can see that
It
through.
just the fact that he has the hobbits save the day is such a quintessential World War One literature theme because they are so clearly meant to represent the common Englishman farmer
Mhm,
who is thrust into this conflict that is greater than them and outside of their understanding, made by forces beyond their control
mhm.
and influence. Like there's just you can't like it's so obvious.
Have you guys seen the Tolkien film they made? I think it was like 2017, 2016 time frame.
I have not. It's one
Yeah.
of those things that's on my list,
Mhm.
and then I'm really bad at watching things.
Because they have great shots like it's actually 2019 film and Nicholas Holt, the new Lex
Yes, I
Luthor.
love Nicholas Hoult, which is also why I want to watch it because
Mhm.
he's one of the few actors whose names I actually know, which means I actually care about his work.
Even though he
But
plays
I
your most
haven't
hated,
seen it. I haven't seen it.
even though he plays your most hated X-Men of all, Hank McCoy.
Listen, listen, he's not a terrible beast. I think actually I would have preferred him to play Beast now as opposed to when he was at that point in
Yeah.
his career because the way that he played Peter in The Great is he can play a good bad guy. We just hadn't seen it yet, and also he got such a sanitized beast. It was obnoxious. Um,
Hey, we're gonna get him
but
as
yeah, I mean, even like World War One literature has influenced so many things.
Mhm.
It's the reason we had the Roaring Twenties to begin with. Like World War One is why the 20s were like that. And beyond that too, I mean, even we're seeing it outside of film and we're seeing it I mean, modern days. There is an entire TTRPG system that is based around the concept of a magical World War One.
Right.
Candela Obscura. I'm so excited to play a campaign in it at some point. Um,
What is your overall favorite World War One film?
I think for me, it is that new version of All Quiet on the Western Front. I think it captures the character development throughout the whole movie. Like they go from these young giddy kids that are excited about this war, excited to make a difference for their country, and then they get to it and they realize this is like the worst possible scenario they could have put themselves in.
Mhm.
And just you see all the heartbreak that they go through. They die. I mean, well, a lot of them, a lot of them do die. But it's just to see everything that happens to them throughout the whole movie is crazy. I mean, there's so many good shots within that film as well. I like how it is a foreign movie as well.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, the version I watched was just a dubbed over English, which
Oh, so you cheated yourself out of it. You just didn't want to read the subtitles.
no, no, I think just the version I watched, it already had the
Yeah.
dubbed over voice. I'm down. I watch Narcos all the time, so I read Spanish subtitles. I'm cool with it. I can do it. I took German for 2 years in high school. Okay, don't.
And Mary's fluent with
I know. Yeah, I know she's fluent in it, so I can handle German. It's not. It's no big deal. No, but it's a good movie, man. I would say like, 1917, I'm sure we'll talk about that,
Yeah, that's one of mine. I
Yeah,
have
Yeah,
like
right.
two.
Yeah, that's
because we can 1917 is amazing as in its own right. So
yeah. So let's go to 1917 because that is one of the ones I actually do enjoy. What did you like about it, Mary, about 1917?
I, it's just really well done.
Yes.
I'm not even sure where to start with it, because um I think part of what I appreciate about it is and I think it's the nature of the assignment that they're on, which is basically just to convey a message.
Hmm.
And that is really how mundane so many of these orders were.
Yeah.
And then what the horrendous things they had to go through to try to follow that order. And these were officers, right? These weren't just enlisted men. So you can only imagine what the enlisted men were having to go through, without all of the resources afforded to officers.
It- see, for me, and I know Pat will know exactly why because of who directed this film. It's Sam Mendes.
Yeah.
And now Mary probably won't like me for saying this because this is a guy I try to get her to convince to watch Road to Perdition, and that's also his movie. But I know now after reading the comics, she will never appreciate the movie whatsoever.
I'm just not into it.
Sam Mendes is really good with one thing, and that's his visuals. That's his shots. And
His visuals are really good.
those shots alone, just like with the airplane coming down at them, the scenes when them going through the trenches and searching for people, it's
Yeah.
really well done and well shot. The colors behind them are really well done.
I
It's
do I do think too that one of the really speaking of the visuals in this film is the introduction of color.
Yeah.
Hmm.
We often think there's a mental conception, and a very popular conception of World War One as a colorless conflict.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of that is kind of perpetuated by the sort of inherent symbolism of black and white and the way that desaturation is used by people who survived the conflict to talk about it in contrast to life before the war, um, which is perfectly understandable and is a excellent artistic choice. But I feel like sometimes that desaturation takes away from the actual nightmare of what the situation was when you have to account for the amount of blood that was being seen in color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It- it- it's 1917 is really good. I love the fact that not even the biggest actors in that film were in main roles. They were
Hmm.
kind of just sideline characters, the ones that kind of
That
just
was a really good choice. That was a really, really good
guess what?
choice.
You had Benedict
It, it, it was a
Cumberbatch,
good support system around those two guys, right? I mean, because those two guys are the main characters throughout the whole film, but then you get I think Mark Strong's in this film,
Mark
right?
Strong is in it. Benedict Cumberbatch is.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
I believe Colin Firth is as well.
Yes, he's the first guy, he's the
Yeah.
first general that gives them the mission.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's quite a bit of big name actors in this film, but the thing is that they're not the main focus.
Hmm.
They are ones that are guiding them, and it's like you guys said, it's like them conveying them to continue on with their mission. It was a
Speaking And sorry, but real quick, speaking of the visuals and all that kind of stuff, right? The colors, which, like you said, the colors, they're great. I see what you mean by that. Like it really shows, like what you were saying, kind of like in real time, like what they were experiencing. You got to kind of think of how that was being portrayed to them. But I think one thing also that we have to throw in for this movie in exact is the fact that it is a continuous shot. It's not a continuous shot, it's edited to seem that way, but man, can we like appreciate the fact that they were able to pull something like that off throughout this whole movie? I think technically it really cuts off once, and it's at the nighttime scene when he's kind of running down through the water and whatnot, and then it kind of cuts out for a little bit. But I mean, other than that, you're watching them go through this whole journey, and I think it just adds a whole different element to this movie.
Well, I'm kind of curious to see what you guys think too, because with this movie, I've never really like I've watched World War One films, but I've never had one keep me on the edge of my seat.
Mhm.
It's never been a movie that I'm like, what's going to happen now, like kind of thing. Like it keeps you on your toes to see what's actually going to happen, and I
Yeah.
think it's well done. If I had to go old school, and I know this movie has not aged well because of the whitewashing of this film, but it is still interesting. I'm kind of curious to see what Mary and you are going to think about
You're
it.
going with Flyboys.
No, oh no, 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 God, no. I'm going with Lawrence of Arabia. This
Oh, yeah.
this movie is not aged well because of the interpretations of how they portrayed certain people in the movie. Alec Guinness plays a yeah. We're not going to go through that whole.
Lawrence of Arabia has a lot going on and not a lot of it's good.
Yeah, it's a good movie overall. It's
If you
just
can turn your brain off and just enjoy a narrative and pretend that these aren't real people and cultures being depicted, by all means.
yeah. But if you get to the point where you're judging that, don't even bother watching it because we're giving you the warning now.
So when I was thinking, I had for a moment actually forgotten that this movie was actually a documentary. Um, and it's the They Shall Not Grow Old, the Peter Jackson documentary that he did, which
Wasn't
is
that like
specifically
2000 like
focused on the narratives of the ordinary enlisted soldier.
that's about 2018, 2019, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
yeah.
2018 is when
That's
it came out.
it is a good documentary, and I did enjoy that. I remember watching that when it first came out because I remember getting attracted to it with Peter Jackson alone. And so when I heard that, I was like, I'll watch it, and I actually liked it. That's a really good.
And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was sort of the mundane quality to the certain narratives that he picked, where he's talking about like the food that they were eating. It's a very social history focused documentary. I feel like so often, World War One is really special in terms of military conflicts because when you study it, you are often no one really cares about the actual military history. And if they do, you're kind of even military history people look at people who only care about the military aspect of World War One and are like, wow, you're a freak. Uh, military history people get that rep in like professional history for a lot of reasons, and usually the gut response is correct. And so like the people who are like, oh yeah, I'm really into like the Battle of Verdun especially, and everyone's like, wow, not going to talk to that guy at the mixer. And but World War One is really special because it is essentially from the get-go has only almost only been framed as a social history,
Mhm.
where we are more focused with the lives of the soldiers. We are more focused with survivors' tales. We are focused with the stories of personal grief and loss than we are with the grand scale numbers. The numbers matter and the numbers are told, but when we are thinking about the conflict, we are often not. The first thing that comes to mind is not the numbers. The first thing that comes to mind is not a particular battle. The first thing that will come to mind is typically some version of, oh my God, those poor men.
Y- And you got a good point here, and that was actually going to lead to my next question too. Is because when we really look at movies, there is only one war really in particular that studies the psychological effects on a soldier, and that is Vietnam. That is what it's most famous for. The question is that World War One really was one of the first wars. I'm not saying there aren't other wars that had psychological damage, but it's the first ones you really saw a lot of psychological damage shown. And we don't,
It's around the time, so psychology is a really young field.
yeah,
And so therapy was just kind of really coming into vogue. I hate to say in vogue, but it was becoming more socially accepted, and less something that you sent people to try to get rid of them. Um, Around the time of Vietnam. Um, we're seeing more of a social acceptance, the beginnings of our acceptance of mental health issues around this point.
mhm,
I was still heavily stigmatized, but like if you were obviously like suffering, like you could get what our limited psychological knowledge at the time could constitute as help.
right. And and that was that's this is a war to me that I kind of always thought about that more like I wish we would get more stuff like that. And I feel like the more that we get with World War One, they're more focused on just the battles in particular. Because we do have a movie about
And
Gulf.
and there that's a lot of the because it's hard, I think, for people to look at a war and try not to tell a story about the war.
Right.
Which is kind of why I like narratives that skirt around World War One. Like the way that it was handled in like Downton Abbey is really well done, specifically because you are able to see. the common people and the aristocracy and their differing takes on how the conflict is going
Mhm.
versus when the men who are actually on the front lines, who are in France and Belgium, when they come back and how they, even as members of the aristocracy, are differing from their peers based solely on the experience they've had there. So that was a really, really good arc. Um, but I think too, we're seeing also a really big push recently, just like honestly in the last few weeks, I've been seeing a lot more people talking about World War One nurses. Um, and a huge line of thought here is that there were girls as young as 16 who were volunteering as nurses who were having grown men refer to them as mother because it was the first time they had ever been away from home and they were dying.
Mhm.
And so those sorts of narratives I think would be really powerful to tell in film. Because it's one thing, right, to read that and not have a visual or a face attached to it. But if you can actually see a 16-year-old caring for someone in their late 20s who is referring to that person as their mother, that's a different story where you can actually see like the delirium and the pain and the grief that everyone is going through.
Okay. Well, now, Pat, let's turn that question over to you. What's your take on that? Because the whole psychological field of this, like Mary says, was not even really even thought of at this point in time. What is something? Why do you feel like we're only get movies about war, like the battles in particular, than compared to getting more in a social context of learning what a soldier's really thinking?
Well, like you said, I mean, we kind of get that from Vietnam, right? We don't get that from other wars or other movies.
It's in MASH, but to a lesser extent.
Yeah, that's actually a good point you bring that up. Yeah, no, MASH.
But MASH is also being made during the Vietnam era.
Mhm.
Which
Right.
is
MASH is
crazy
being
to
made
think
really as a
about.
response
Yeah.
to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Mhm.
With World War One, I mean, the potential's there to focus on that psychological part too, right? With all the hell they had to go through and whatnot. And I think that kind of lures back to the All Quiet on the Western Front, especially this newer version, in my opinion. It kind of it captures that part of it. Um, Now as far as the battle part goes, I mean, is there a certain movie in particular that just focuses on one battle? Because
Gallipoli.
what's that again?
Gallipoli.
Gallipoli.
Okay.
And that's Mel Gibson, Mark Lee, Bill Kerr, Ron Graham, directed by Peter Weir.
Hmm.
I think it's also kind of important to note that even movies that aren't technically focusing on only one battle, because of the way that war was structured, even if they're not specifying what the battle is, it all runs together.
Right.
And so I think it's more battle in general that we're talking about and not just like a specific battle, because I think what could be a really powerful tool for discussing World War One would be to actually like have a start with someone who is a farmer or just a laborer, a common man, a peasant, essentially, in any of these European countries and follow them from before the war
To after.
to after. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. Doesn't We don't have to spend a whole lot of time with them before the war. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time with them after. But I think it's really important that we meet these soldiers before they are soldiers.
Right.
Because so often in these movies, we're meeting them in the middle of the conflict.
You don't get any background story of that character itself, right?
Yes, and I feel like that would play actually really well with the historiography that we're seeing.
Uh-huh.
Um, and World War One is also there's a lot of it's kind of linked inherently in Great Britain, especially. There's so much research on World War One with Great Britain, but it is really linked to like the downfall of certain aristocracy and like the boundaries between the gentry and the common man, because it was a unifying experience across the board for officers who often got their position as an officer just by being born rich
Right.
and into the right family and not through any actual, military training. Um, a problem Great Britain has had for a long, long, long time. Um, and then the common man, who are the ones who are actually doing the work. And it was a unifying experience for them, and it brought a lot of landed men and rich men a whole lot closer to people that they had up until that point not viewed as being equal to them.
Mm.
And it was a great equalizer. Um, and there's a lot of really interesting literature around that in the writing of these men. And there's a lot of really interesting history being written around that topic.
There's something else I want to talk about that, and this one bugs me, and this also comes from the comic book aspect. World War One has become so popular that in the Wonder Woman movie, they actually switched her origins to World War One instead of being in World War Two. This is now, what was your take on that twist too? Because this, I know this is a fictional compared to actual.
I thought it was really interesting because I think it was kind of playing not only World War One was just significantly in the public consciousness at the time.
Mhm.
Um, it was one of those things where people were bringing it up. And so positioning it through that sort of trend, because this was what, 2019?
Yeah, 2017. 2017.
2017, right? So we're literally in the middle of the 100th anniversary of the war. Um, and so it's already in the public consciousness. It's being positioned along with a whole bunch of other World War One films. Just baseline, that's a good strategy.
Yeah,
If you're marketing something and you're following a war trend and there's going to be a war in your movie,
right.
yeah, it makes sense. But I think too, with the concept of the mythos of Wonder Woman dealing with the sins and falls, failures of man, that World War One is just such a good war to go with.
Mhm.
And I think one of the reasons it's a good war to go with is because there isn't like a clear inherent bad guy. All of them suck. No one should be winning this war. No one should be in this war. It shouldn't have happened to begin with.
Right.
And I think it was a really good choice to pick. Um, this isn't to say that the World War II origin is bad. Far from it. I'm really fond of the World War II origin. But I think that sometimes it's interesting to put Wonder Woman in positions where there is less moral clarity on right and wrong, and where the wrong to be conquered is violence and not necessarily some like stark apparent moral failing.
Right. I was kind of curious to see, and I'm going to ask Pat the same thing because I agree with you. I thought it was a marketing strategy for them. It was a sense of DC Comics going with the whole thing of, and it's like you said, World War One's an interesting way to put her origin story, and for the reason being too is that this war did lead to other big events that happened later on down the road.
Yeah.
There was, without World War One,
Yes.
not meaning it in the like we wouldn't have World War Two.
Mhm.
There was a lot of things that came out of World War One that affected why we went into World War Two.
I was gonna say, so with all the World War One movies that are out there, do you guys think that the reason why there's not as many is because of, and I've thought about this before, but America didn't have a very long occupancy in World War One, right? We probably had a year and some change. And because of that, and with how big the American film industry is, do you think the reason why there's not as many World War One movies is because of how short of a time America itself was occupied in the war?
So I think part of it is just we weren't in it very long.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I was kind of fortunate to grow up in an area where like we did have a World War One memorial for my teeny little town of 300 people. Um, and it was kind of like in front of someone's house. Like it wasn't even like a real like memorial. It was just like a little obelisk that looked like the obelisk in the graveyard a block away.
They're just like the
It
town.
just had the it just had like World War One, like these men from this town served in World War One, and then it was a list of names.
Gotcha.
So like it's always kind of been in my consciousness even before I formally studied it. But I think the one of the key differences with World War One and World War Two is that World War Two was videoed. There
Mhm.
were movies being being made about it while it was happening. In World War II, like we actively sent filmmakers to World War II. Um, the American movie industry made World War II sort of into what it was. And then our film industry was irrevocably changed and grown, and it grew because of World War II. World War One film is still really, really young. Like we are not even quite at like the silent film era, right? That's what we really think about for like the 20s and 30s. We're not even at the stage where we're thinking about talkies, man. We're like we are getting to like we're on the level of like, oh my God, it's a train. Like we're the film's really young.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the techniques that are being used are like still photography techniques.
Mhm.
Um, and so there's a lot of, and also like a trench, like it's just a completely different environment. Like we didn't know what to expect. We weren't there for very long.
Mhm.
Our reasons for being there were kind of weird and sketchy. Um, and it's again, I think too, World War II had a very clear like moral drive to it. Um, there was a clear enemy. That was not the case for World War One, especially when we know that the end of the 19th century had an influx of immigration from literally every country involved.
Yep.
Every country involved. We had thousands and thousands of brand new Americans who had just come from there. And so there wasn't a really good way for us to market any one country as an enemy, especially when the origins of the conflict were so clouded, with the exception of like the stark assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Germany's invasion of Belgium. And those are like the two big ones. But even those are happening in different countries for different unrelated political movements and reasons. They just happen to be colliding factors in the house of cards that was European politics in the 1910s. And so I think part of the difference is that film made World War II and World War II made film, whereas World War One was more of a letter writing campaign. It was a politics marker and it was a communications game, telegraphs and the like. It wasn't so much built around like an idea, but rather the dismantling of ideas. And I think it's harder to create a film around something being dismantled than it is to create one around something being built.
It's like I said in the beginning of the podcast, the whole thing of World War One films, when you really pay attention to it nowadays, aren't really made by American filmmakers. They're helped produced by like Warner Brothers and things like that. But in reality, who's making the films?
Mhm.
You know, people from British backgrounds or German backgrounds
Well,
or
because they probably got obviously a more extensive or better outlook on the war itself, right, compared to
They
us.
also, a lot of them have some sort of family connection.
yes.
It's a lot of Americans have a grandfather or a great grandfather who served in World War II.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of Americans went to Europe for World War One.
It's a sense of that's why when you really think about it, America going into World War One was kind of like we were already getting, mind you, we were helping shipping goods and our ships were getting blown up like nothing. Like seriously. And the one thing that triggered us to go to war is Germany trying to send a telegram going, "Hey, Mexico, why don't you invade America?" And then that's what made us go into.
Also, the Lusitania, which was like, why this ship?
Yeah, it's like
This
out
has
of
happened to other ships. Why this one in particular?
yeah, it's a
Um,
sense of why are we not getting that? Like why it took us that long to get to that point. And it's a war that I feel like, and it's better told by other countries. It's well told by other countries. It's like Mary says, when you have those ancestors from World War One that can actually like transpire
if
their
you
story.
have the artifacts in your house, it's easier to build an emotional connection with the history.
Yeah.
That's one of the things they actually teach you when you are studying to be a history teacher, is that if you can bring in an artifact, it'll drive student engagement. Um, which is why trips to museums are so important and why you shouldn't be cutting field trip funding. Anyway, uh, I think it's also important to remember that World War One was also coinciding with the Spanish flu epidemic.
Yeah.
And I would like to remind, we recently went through a pandemic. Do we want to necessarily be making media about that? Anyone looking for, yeah. Um, that's kind of why this bit, like, it was a huge factor of World War II. I mean, it's happening in 1918. Um, but like, and that was when our involvement was happening.
It's, that's why I said, when you really think of it, and that's why I think to answer your question more, Pat, I think that's why you've seen a surge lately.
Yeah.
And only because of that, it's just like we said, it comes from different countries. It's coming from different perspectives. And I think that's what's great, because when you look at World War II films, who mostly makes them? America does.
Us.
That was one of the things that I don't know if you saw it, but the All the Light They Cannot See movie that just came out, the actor is actually German.
Mhm.
Lewis Hoffman is he's played in the past also a POW, I believe,
Mhm.
from the German side of the war. Um,
It, and that's the whole thing. When you really, it's like Mary said, when you look at World War II, you think of, this is when movie was popular. This is when you had documentaries like shooting live what was going on.
if you went to a movie in 1943, you were first going to sit through a war propaganda film that was shot in Europe or on the Pacific Theater.
Yep. That was it.
That was just what it was going to happen.
I think the only movies that you can really think of like that actually show that really well is, what was it? Hacksaw Ridge does that with the
Mhm.
whole scene. That's how he gets kind of persuaded to go in.
It's in
And
Captain America, the First Avenger.
yeah, well, what was it? It's even in the Rocketeer, but people tend to forget about that one too. But anyway, but that's the point. But it even Pearl Harbor has it, which Pat, still, that's not a good World War II film, other than the war scenes of it all.
I was gonna say the battle part's pretty cool.
Battle parts are good. Everything else about that film, no.
I mean, come on.
The
I
love
don't.
triangle, no.
It's made by Michael Bay, for crying out loud. All
Yeah,
right.
exactly why. Michael Bay just pumps out money and doesn't care about actually
I
doing
mean,
realistic
it's the
movie.
same guy that made Transformers, all right?
That's
Yeah,
not, yeah,
that's not an endorsement,
yeah,
Pat.
that's, that's,
No, I'm not endorsing him. I'm just comparing, like, come on, like this is how ridiculous this is.
I think we should get Erica on a really her 2 cents about Transformers movies.
We are so good at staying on topic
But
here.
we love our
Yes, we
tangents.
are. Yes, we are.
We love our tangents. But yeah, that's why I said, Pat, I think that's the best way to answer your question. Really look at the context of it all. And especially nowadays, it's the whole sense of who's making them. If America makes it, it's not really influential compared to when you look at somebody from Britain or somebody from like even Australia, because Australia was even part of the war for a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are
That's crazy.
more impactful
Uh-huh.
compared to what you get from America in that war.
Well, even in World War One, weren't we? Wasn't Africa part of World War One?
Yes. Huge, 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 huge.
Yeah, that's a lot of people don't think about that either. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, you got to remember, there was a lot of colonies. There was a lot of things the British still own. So pretty
yeah,
much a lot
Great
of,
Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, they all had colonial holdings in Africa.
yeah. It was, yeah. It was.
It's messy.
It's more impactful there because the war was mainly taking place with those countries alone.
mhm.
And then America came in the last year and pretty much shut it down. Even then, can you really say if they did that or not? No, we had our own intentions as well. And that's the biggest thing.
I think too, we're also missing the opportunity. I love bringing this up to like people who are just getting introduced to World War One. So like when I'm talking to like my students, I love this information because it always blows their minds. Um, is that the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were first cousins.
I forgot about that too.
And they were so closely related that the King of England and the Tsar of Russia could have been twins. They could have swapped with each other, and only the accents would have given them away. You can look this up, Pat. It's eerie. Um, and there is so much that you could do with that narrative, especially with the letters that you have from all three of them, talking about how if they are all in agreement that if their grandmother had been alive, this war never would have happened.
Facts.
Now,
Um, and there's been some pushing from stories for like the narratives around Irish independence for including
mhm,
World War One because it is a huge drive. I mean, the Easter Rising of 1916 is happening in the middle of this conflict. And it's one of the contributing factors to the conflict, as well as the fact that Germany was trying to smuggle arms into Ireland to aid their independence bid against the UK. There's a lot going on, not just within the war itself, but in all of these individual countries
mhm.
being impacted by World War One. So even if you're not telling a narrative about the war specifically, every European country is touched by World War One in a different way.
Wow.
I think we are also constantly missing any narrative around Serbia.
Yes. I
And I think there is so much potential there. Not just in turn, like we don't hear about like Serbia, like Serbians assassinated Franz Ferdinand,
yeah.
and then they're immediately forgotten as part of this conflict. The tensions for Serbian independence literally kickstarted so much of this conflict.
Yeah.
And then Germany invades Belgium, and suddenly the question is, who's Serbia?
Yeah. And that was the weirdest part about that, right? Is that when you really look at that whole conflict, I agree. Because that was something I thought about too. It's like, why Serbia is the start of it all, but yeah, then what happens to them? They're overshadowed by all these other countries, and it becomes a situation like that. Um, you know, now I got a question I want to ask you guys, and I think this is kind of a good way to lead out. Are there World War One films that you would love to be seen or you would love to see on the screen? Because there are certain stories still to be told that we have not yet seen about World War One. And I'm kind of curious to see where you guys would love to see it take.
I'd like to see like more not a British version necessarily, but like maybe Britain's point of view from it. I know 1917 isn't that kind of that's Britain, right?
Yeah, that is
Yes,
right.
I
the vast majority of narratives are.
but I also wish we got more earlier parts of the war. And I think that's where, obviously the US isn't involved, but I think it'd be cool to see like a movie based on the foundations of what started this war.
Well, that's why I said I think it'd be interesting there because a lot of people forget even Russia was in it, but Russia wasn't in it very long either. Russia was in it and they had their own civil war start up. That was a
Mhm.
problem they had. That's
Well,
when Rasputin and
I was
all
gonna say that's when the whole bullshit or the yeah.
the communism party was coming into play a little bit more. But wasn't that part of that too, Mary? I was going to ask you. Serbia was kind of getting involved with that too because that's where you had Marx and stuff like that go to. Not Marx,
Yeah,
Lenin.
but we're not, but it's not often connected to like the grander World War One narrative.
Right.
Um, the whole Serbian independence thing gets dropped real fast.
Yeah.
Well, do you think the fall, like, is the fall of the Romanov dynasty part of World War One, you think?
Oh, 100%. That is
Yeah.
why the Bolsheviks could do what they did. I took a Russian Revolution class.
Yeah.
Um, basically, like it was like a special topics class in college. Clayton Black, you will always be famous to me for playing Hindi hip hop music in your car on the way home from a conference. He made me put the CD in. I love him dearly.
Like I wouldn't mind, and I hate to say because it's something we just talked about, like America not really being a big part of it, but I kind of wouldn't mind to see something in their point of view because we don't get that tons. But even then, there's not really much to go off of for that. Um, it's like we said, I think more important story, like because a lot of people forget too. There's a lot of a lot of heroes from World War II that were involved in World War One. You have Churchill being one of the big ones. MacArthur, Eisenhower, Patton. There's a lot of them that would just gain their start in the military during this time frame.
I mean, Churchill is his rise and fall comes from World War One.
Yeah.
I was searching and I was like, these aren't right. It's because I took the first name from one guy and the last name from the other guy and was like, this is one person. It was not.
It was not. It's two people.
It's two people. But the relationship between Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, who are two poets, who both served in World War One together, and the way that their literature influences each other and the way that they mentor each other in terms of poetry, but also their actual relationship to one another, especially as known queer soldiers from World War One. I think it would be a really, really great narrative to tell because it incorporates the anti-war literature, the vocal critique of the British government's continuation of the war, as well as the relationship between men on the front lines, and the way in which they are viewing each other and interacting with each other, and how social norms are becoming blurred, and what might have been taboo is now more accepted just because they are all trying to survive. Really, really interesting narratives there.
I think this is a good way to end out the podcast. I want to thank Mary again for joining us for this wonderful conversation about World War One and how prominent it's becoming more in the movie field. Check out J4F Podcast on Instagram and TikTok, and check out Just for Flicks on Spotify. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Pat to take us out.
Yeah, thank you guys for everything. Thank you, Mary, again for everything. Very knowledgeable, and that was definitely a fun conversation. Thank you, B-Dog, as always, and thank you, fans. And remember, we do it just for flicks. Good night, everyone.